Talk about using a sliding compound miter saw. We're going to talk about the safety and how to come in with all your fingers and leave with all your fingers as well. So to start with, there's a few things about a sliding compound miter saw. First off, that it slides, so it slides back and forth. It allows for a wider cut than a traditional miter saw that will just simply chop straight down. Chop saw is kind of a slang term for these. Because originally they only move straight down. Another thing that has been added to these machines is that they can cut compound miters. So a miter cut is an angled cut, like so. So you can tilt it to an angle. Now this one's a compound miter, so if you notice, right back here there's also another gauge that allows us to tilt the saw head to the side, and then we can cut that. And to do that, you lift this right here, and then while that's lifted, you tilt it. And I'm not sure I can do that while holding this phone. There we go. Tilt it, and now you've got two different angles at once. So that's a compound miter. And there are times in our classes where we will use those. For example, if you're making some legs for a stool and you want to have them both tilted to maybe a 10-degree angle, then that's where it comes in really handy. In a house, where you would use this is probably when you're doing your baseboards, your trim, crown molding, so all that kind of thing where you're going to have multiple angles. Okay. To start with, notice that we have a blade guard. The guard always needs to be intact. If it's sticking or anything like that, notify the teacher right away, and we need to get that fixed. And please do not use it. This one has an option for a light, so turn that switch on, now you've got a light. Some have a laser that will help line up your cutting mark. And as always, we need to have it connected to the dust collector or have a dust bag on it. This one is connected to the dust collector, so the dust collector does need to be turned on. What's handy about this machine too is that it's got an actual digital gauge right here showing what angle we are at. So if we turn it, you can be very precise with your cuts. Okay. All these little notches right here are preset angles that are common angles that this will just slide in and fit to exactly. So for example, there's 15, 22.5, which is of course half of 45 degrees, and then 45 is another common angle. Okay, when using a miter saw, normally types of cuts that we're going to be doing on this are either going to be a cross cut, so you're cutting across the wood grain. You notice that the wood grain is running in this direction. That's the way most of the lines of the wood are running. So we're cutting across that grain, or we're going to be cutting on an angle, which is still going across that grain, so a mitered cut. Since those are the type of cuts that we're going to be doing, we're going to be using what's called a crosscut blade on this machine, and just the angle of the teeth and the pattern on the teeth is what's going to determine whether it's set up for cross-cutting or whether it's set up for ripping. And ripping would be when you're cutting with the grain, and we never want to rip on a miter saw. Other option that we could have for a blade on here would be a combination blade, and a combination blade allows for both ripping and cross-cutting. But that would be fairly rare to find that on a miter saw. This machine has come to replace in a lot of school shops and workplaces what used to be fairly common, which was a radial arm saw. And radial arm saws had some safety issues. Worked really well, but they definitely had some safety issues. Okay. So anytime that you go to use this machine, you need to be able to turn the machine on. On this machine and most machines, there's going to be a safety switch. So if we slide around to the back here, there's this little flap. Let's see if I can find that. There's a little flap right here that will slide to the side. So you slide that to the side, and then you squeeze. Okay. So to get that, we want to make sure that the machine is all the way to full speed before starting. Sorry about that. So we're going to slide that all the way to the side. Full speed. Make sure the machine is completely to full speed before it touches the material. Otherwise, well, it's going to make a really poor cut. It's going to tear through it. As well, it can dig in and cause the saw to either kick back towards you, towards the operator, or you can also cause the piece of wood to dig in and then bind on the blade and kick back. Alright. You'll notice that there are some warnings here not to get your fingers too close. This red area, definitely never have your fingers in that area. You're going to be losing some fingers pretty quickly. Okay. I'm just gonna grab a pencil. So anytime that we go to make a cut, we want to have it marked out. So we're going to use a square, and we're going to draw a nice straight line marking out our cut. Remember that, oh, looks like I need a pencil sharpened. Remember that you want to hold the pencil loosely and always drag back towards yourself. Then we have our mark. And then another good habit to get into is to put an X on the scrap side, or the side that you don't want. Why is that important? Well, because every time that we make a cut, that blade is going to take out 1/8 of an inch, or close to 1/8 of an inch, whatever width our blade is. And if we have that on the wrong side, we're going to be 1/8 of an inch too short with our piece. If we have it cut down the middle of our line, then we're going to be half of blade width off. So we want to just barely graze that blade. Bring your piece of wood over, and then you're going to bring the saw down, line it up with your mark. Sometimes you got to nudge it just a little bit. If you go too far, you can bring it back, so on and so forth. Once you have it lined up, next thing that you're going to do is you're going to hold that piece of wood firmly. So when you're holding it firmly, I like to get into the habit of not having my finger sticking out. That's just another, now they're just closer to the blade than need be. And I get into the habit though of putting my thumb against this edge and pushing it tight against the fence, and then also pushing down. I don't want to have my hand too far away from the blade either, because then if there's any kind of warp to that wood, then you're not going to have great control over it. So you need to have it kind of in this general area and have good control over it. If you think that piece of wood's going to move, then you shouldn't be cutting it with this machine. Or you should be using this right here, which is a clamp or a hold down clamp, and clamping that down. We can lift that up and stick it down over here. Alright, so while we're talking about that, we have our scrap side, and you'll notice that I placed my good side to the left of the blade. That is a safety feature, a safety rule. Some of you that might be left-handed might be tempted to grab onto the saw trigger with your left hand, and then have your right hand across holding that piece of wood down and just going to try trim off a little bit. And if that kicks back, it's going to take and make some damage. So you never want to do that. There is one exception to this, and that would be that, let's say that we're cutting a really small piece, and this is the piece that we want to keep, and this is our scrap side. That would not be very safe to hold on to our piece of wood over here and then hold over and then use our saw over here. So in that case, then we're going to flip it around. We're going to keep track of, by using our X marking our scrap side, we're going to line up our blade on the scrap side and hold onto the scrap side. But most of the time you want to have your good piece to the left of the blade and scrap to the right. Why is that important too? Well, because if we're trying to cut and we're trying to line that up, when you're standing over here, the blade, the guard, the handle, everything, my hand, it's all getting in the way and it's hard to see. Whereas over here, it's easy to see. While we're standing here too, talking about this, you don't want to stand directly behind the blade in case it does kick back at you, and you don't have as much control over your piece of wood. Instead, this kind of working triangle right in this space right here is where you want to stand. putting pressure down onto the wood and holding it nice and firm. Okay, when we make our cut, what we want to do is we're going to bring the saw down, we're going to line up our cut, we're going to get it lifted up just a little bit, get it full speed, and then there's a few things you can do. Well, one trick is to start the machine up full speed and then go gently across the surface and back, down, and then go forward. And what that does is it prevents splintering. That can be a little bit more tricky at times though. So the other thing you can do is you can just go straight down through the piece of wood like a traditional chop saw would have done, or you can bring the saw all the way back, down, and just go straight forward. So a few different techniques. Another way to prevent splintering, and this works with any machine really, any other saw, is you can put a piece of tape across where you're going to cut, and that tape will help hold that down a little bit and prevent those fibers from splintering. You'll notice that this saw, the blade turns in this direction, so when it's cutting through, it's going to start to lift those fibers up, and it will splinter out the top surface more than the bottom surface. Alright, so we are connected to the dust collector like I said, so we should have that on, but for this demonstration we'll leave it off just so you can hear. This machine can cut at least up to two different angles at once, like I said, so compound miter. And it is important to keep in mind what kind of material you're cutting. So this right here is spruce, and spruce is a softwood that's really quite easy to cut. It's easy to get through. But if we were cutting something that's a hardwood, like a maple, an oak, walnut, anything like that, they're quite a bit more dense and a lot harder surface. So in that case then, we're going to go a lot slower through that cut and just let the machine do the cutting. And that's kind of the key with all machines, is that you let the machine do the work. Don't force it. So if you start to force it, then that's where you're going to get into trouble and you're going to get kicked back. Or blades breaking. Not so much on this, but I'm thinking of the bandsaw. If you are going to try to cut something really small on here, if you can't have good control of it and keep your fingers far enough away from it, then you shouldn't be cutting that on this machine. Then you should find an alternate machine or possibly hand tools. So with that, we'll try to do a quick cut. Hopefully you can see it all. Line it up, bring that down, and start it. And one of the main things with this is that you don't want to lift the blade up until it's completely come to a stop. Once it's come to a stop, you'll notice that right now most of the teeth are below the table, and our piece of wood itself is actually protecting us from the teeth. If we raise that up, now those teeth are exposed, and that's another danger point. As well, it could catch that scrap piece and cause that to kick back. Alright, so always let it come to a stop while it's down, then once it's stopped, then raise it up. And that's safety with the miter saw.